morning, guys and gals of the YTPC and those interested in restoring pipes. Here's a quick look at the pipes in their original state. This is going to be a long video, partially because I like to talk a lot and also because I wanted to be thorough and give you as much detail as I could about the restoration process. So, you ready? Let's go. Okay, so the first thing I do when I am getting ready to do pipe restoration, whether it's one or three, is I like to take a look at them. When you're buying things off eBay, it's kind of hard to tell always what you're going to get. And so what I'm looking for during the initial inspection of the pipes is kind of my plan of attack, right? Are there a lot of marks in the bowl? Are there, large cracks that are going to affect the smokability of the pipe, etc.? And if I run into those things and I'm still interested in restoring that pipe, I may send it off to a professional restorer to do some of the heavy lifting. But you can see these pipes are actually pretty tarnished, but overall they're in pretty good shape. And I'll do the same inspection on all three of these pipes. And again, looking for major flaws, looking for things that might send me a different direction. I'm also kind of trying to anticipate whether or not I'm going to need to sand them down all the way to bare briar, or whether or not I'll be able to sand them down to basically just repolish them. So on these three pipes, it really appears that they're all three in fairly good shape. The stems are heavily oxidized on the Chippendale that I'm showing you here, as well as the Ewan Reese. Not as much oxidation on the Bulldog. And I'm also looking for things like stamps. How heavy are the stamps? How deep are they? Am I going to have to avoid sanding in those areas to make sure that I can try to retain any markings that are on the pipe, etc. So that's really kind of the first inspection. I go through that on all three pipes. I'm going to go ahead and move forward to the initial cleaning that I do on all of the pipes. Okay, first up, we're going to take care of the stems. So you're going to need a container of water that you're going to use to soak the stems in for a couple hours or more. You're also going to need some OxiClean. Now, I use the non-scented, no-dye version of OxiClean. You can pick this up in almost any grocery store. And believe me when I say this stuff works wonders on oxidized pipe stems. Now, as you'll see here in just a second, I use a healthy amount of OxiClean in solution because I'm going to let it sit for, like I said, anywhere from a couple hours to longer. I want to make sure that there's enough in that solution to kind of get in the nooks and crannies of the stems themselves. I usually will take one of the stems, or a stem if I'm only doing one pipe, and I'll use that to kind of stir up the OxiClean, just to kind of get it broken up a little bit. It has a tendency to clump in the bottom of the container if you're not careful. So as you can see here, I'll stir it up, and then I will take each of the three pipe stems, and I'm just going to drop them in. I do like to kind of put them in at an angle if I can, or make sure that the insides of the pipe stem are also in that solution, because the stuff is going to eat away the tobacco and everything that's kind of built up over years of use. So I actually learned this trick from home brewing days. OxiClean, you can use this stuff to clean out carboys, you can use it for laundry, you can use it for quite a few different things. So note, at this point, I'm not going to soak the bowls in OxiClean. That would probably wreak havoc on the bowls themselves. So once you get all three pipes placed in solution, you'll just set that off to the side, and you'll come back to that later in the process, as will I. And as you can see here, it's already started working, doing its job. Okay, now that we have the stems soaking, we're gonna switch our attention over to the bowls. And in order to do the initial cleaning on each one of the bowls, there's a couple of things you're gonna need. One is another pail of water, and you're also gonna need some Murphy's oil soap. You can get this again in any grocery store. I will tell you that I've seen a lot of folks do this step in the process straight out of the bottle. I think that the Murphy's oil soap is a little too harsh to do straight out of the bottle. If there's fills or anything like that in any of the bowls, the Murphy's oil soap is strong enough to take those fills out. So you'll see I use a fairly generous amount, but I am going to dilute it for this part of the process. I find it works fine. It'll get the top layer of tarnish off of the bowls really without any issue at all. So at this stage, we're just going to take a toothbrush. This is an old toothbrush that I have laying around specifically for this purpose. And we're just going to go to town on each one of these bowls. This is a fairly lengthy process, so I'm likely going to speed this up here in just a second. But just wanted to give you guys kind of a feel for the initial cleaning process as it relates to using the Murphy's oil soap. And I don't know if you can see it here, but what you'll see is the color from the stain is actually already in solution. And that's because all of the gunk and the top layer of tarnish, which would be, carnauba wax or any other waxes that have been placed on the bowls, is actually coming off. So the Murphy soap does a really good job at getting the top layer of grime off of each one of the bowls. And then we're going to do a sanding process later where we'll make sure that that top layer is off, and then we'll make a determination at that point as to whether or not we need to sand all the way down or whether or not the Murphy's oil soap is good enough. So you'll see in these clips here, if you can when it's sped up, but you'll see that these things cleaned up quite nice, such that I didn't have to do a whole lot of major sanding. Okay, so I wanted to slow this part down just so that I can provide you with a tip. So you'll notice that the top of even your own pipes, they often darken around the edge of the bowl. And that is predominantly because as you light your pipe, the flame will kiss the outer ring of the bowl itself. And all the carnauba wax or any other waxes that you have on the surface of that pipe will actually caramelize or burn. So the good news about this is if you take particular attention to brushing in these areas, you should be able to get most of that stuff off without even having to sand. And you'll notice here, I'm not overly concerned about getting things in the bowl because I'm also going to do a light sanding on them. But try not to get that Murphy's oil soak, try not to let it soak into that bowl because if you do, there's a good chance that you're going to end up with a Murphy's oil aromatic, and that's probably not what you're looking for. And to that end, I wanted to make sure that you all saw this process as well. So once I'm done with the initial cleaning, I'll take the bowls to the sink and I'll turn them upside down, rinse them off, make sure that there's no Murphy's oil soap, and then I'll take a paper towel, a napkin, whatever you got laying around, and I'll stuff it down in each one of the bowls, and I'll give it a good tight spin in there. And what I'm doing is trying to get rid of any residual Murphy oil soap that might have gotten in there, just to be on the safe side. And I'll do that with all three of the bowls. And then once I'm done with kind of drying out the inside of the bowls, what you're going to see next is that I will take a pipe cleaner and I'll do the same thing in the stems. And again, just a kind of preemptive measure to make sure that you don't get any residual soap left inside the stem. And then once I'm done with that, again, I'll do that to all three, just like you're normally doing a pipe cleaning after you've done smoking. It doesn't have to be exhaustive. You're just trying to get any of the residual moisture out of there so that they'll dry a little bit easier. Now, once I'm done with kind of drying the pipes, making sure that they're all dry on the inside and the out, I'll do another inspection. And the reason I do this is because oftentimes as you clean with the Murphy's Oil soap, you'll get a really good idea of what the grain looks like under any of the tarnished top layer. And then you'll also find other potential flaws. As was the case on this Chippendale, I found a couple of cracks. And it looks like they had been repaired at some point in the long term past because they were also covered up. And you'll also see how clean I was able to get this Ewan Reese on the rim. And again, that thing had, if you refer back to the original pictures of it, the bowl was pretty well caked at the top with kind of that black gook that burns on the top of your bowl that I explained earlier. This pipe actually has pretty nice looking grain and not a lot of falls. I didn't find any fills in this one. So I think it's going to polish up fairly nice without having to do a lot of sanding. And then finally the Bulldog. The Bulldog, I was a little worried because I wasn't able to get that whole rim clean right there around the edge. Not as clean as I'd like to on the initial cleaning. Sometimes if that happens, you can use whiskey or denatured alcohol to try to get the rest of that gook off. But in this case, you'll see later, I just sanded it very lightly with some high grit, actually low grit, high number sandpaper, and I'll show you that process in a little bit. But you can see these things turned out really nice just from the initial cleaning. In terms of restoration, they're making my job a little easier. All right, now we're on to the stem. So we'll set the bowls aside and we're gonna have to get out a couple of supplies for this process. So you'll see that I have some pipe cleaners, and these pipe cleaners are the ones that have the bristles in them. And I think that's real important to have this type of cleaner. You'll also need some of the other pipe cleaners as well. You'll use those primarily for drying, but you'll use the ones with the bristles inside to do a lot of the scrubbing of all of the nasty stuff that's sitting inside that stem. So these brushes also come in handy. So sometimes there's some particularly difficult grime to get out of the inside of the stem, and if that's the case, then I have these as kind of a backup. I don't always use them. I prefer to use the pipe cleaners, but sometimes you need to resort to desperate measures. So as you can see, this sat for quite a while. I'm trying to give you a better look at how much discoloration there is to it almost looks like Mountain Dew with that light up next to it, but how much discoloration actually comes out of the pipe just from the OxiClean. Now I let this rest for more than a couple of hours. I went to my daughter's basketball game, but you can see just immediately pulling these things out how much of a difference it makes. Now, as you feel them, you're gonna feel kind of almost like a soft layer. Don't be worried, you haven't ruined the stem. You're gonna just take a toothbrush and brush it right off. And that's basically all that layer of oxidation. You're not gonna get it off 100% using this process, but you're gonna get it off enough to where when you start doing a wet dry sandpaper or micro pads, as you'll see that I use, you'll be able to get that pretty much all of the oxidation off of these stems. So you pull each one of the stems out and you just go to town on brushing them. And I'll kind of speed that process up for you just a little bit, and so we'll get to the inside of the stems here in just a second. So now we're going to move on to the inside of the stem, and I've done, I think, each one of these one at a time. So I dip the pipe cleaner inside the solution, and yes, that is gross. You're going to wash your hands when it's all said and done. And I just thread the pipe cleaner just like you're cleaning your pipe at home after a use. Now you'll notice what I do here is I bend the end of each end of the pipe cleaner. And what that's going to do is if it kind of catches or grabs, it keeps you from pulling the pipe cleaner completely out. So I'm just going to go back and forth, pull it to each side. And you'll notice on the bottom of the stem, the part that is where the smoke comes out of the stem, I'll pull to the left and to the right, just like that. And the reason I do that is because if you ever notice the inside of your stems, where they breach, there's often a groove that kind of fans out towards the edges. And I want to make sure that I get in that area as well for the cleaning. So I'm going to go ahead and speed up the rest of this process. You'll see just for demonstration purposes, I used one of these just to kind of show you how you would do it. But I'm going to speed up the rest of this process to get through the other two stems so that we can move on to the next step of the process. Okay, well now we're off to the next part of the process, and this is going to be where we sand. So you're going to need a thing of water because we're going to do wet sanding on these stems. This is also the longest part and probably the most tedious part of the entire process. So I don't use sandpaper. I use these little micro mesh pads. They come in different colors. They come as a package. They come in different colors, and the different colors represent the different grits in sandpaper, and I'll show you that piece of paper so you know what they are here in just a second. So they go from 1500 and they are stacked in order in the package, and I recommend keeping them that way because it makes it a lot easier because the colors aren't exact. But as you can see, they go all the way up to 12,000, which is basically, it almost feels like you're sanding with a piece of rubber. So we're gonna go through the sanding process on this. I'm gonna put on some tunes for you, and I'm gonna speed this process up because, as I said, it does take a long time. The bit of advice that I will give you, though, is as you pull out each one of the micro pads, make sure that you have them in the right order because you can undo whatever you just did if you go in the wrong order. So again, you can see the colors aren't exact, so leave them in the exact same order that they come out. It'll make things a lot easier, and it'll save you a bunch of time. So one more tip before I speed things along here. You really need to take your time with this part of the process. In my opinion, the two things that really make a pipe look nice is a very polished stem and a nice finish on the bowl. And when I say take your time, every one of these stems is going to be a different shape, and you're going to want to make sure that you get up into the cracks and crevices as much as you can. You'll see this one's a saddle bit, and so you can see how much grime comes off of that. That's actually the rest of that oxidation that the OxiClean didn't get. But you can see this one's a saddle bit, and you want to make sure that you sand as much as you can around those kind of hard edges on stems. And believe it or not, there's quite a few hard edges on stems. And you'll also want to make sure that you get around the tip of the bit. And I should warn you, be careful with the heavy grit sandpaper around the tip of the bit. You're going to be, you'll probably have the same tendency I do, which is to sand really heavily towards the edge to try to get teeth marks, try to get teeth chatter, etc., all that good stuff off. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit just so you can kind of see the process, and then I'll come back to another tip that will help us take care of any teeth indentations that you might find in the bowl. I'm sorry, on the stem. All right, so let's talk teeth chatter. Almost every estate pipe that you buy or find is likely to have teeth marks. They'll either be fairly light if you're lucky, or there'll be indentations like you see here. And I know that focus isn't the greatest, but you'll see indentations. Now, you'll see what I'm going to use here is a set of jeweler's files that I got off Amazon. You don't have to spend a lot of money on these things. I can't imagine these things are more than 10 bucks. The reason I want to use a jeweler's file is because you'll see I want to have a lot of control of the file itself. And I feel like if you used a big shop, one, you might take off too much of the material, and two, you wouldn't have as much control in your hand. And so you'll see here I'm kind of going in a circular pattern. If I do go back and forth for the heavier dents, I'll go back and forth, but also changing directions up and down over the stem. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to feather out where I am filing. And I learned this trick in auto body years ago. The more you can feather it out with a file, the easier it's going to be when you actually go to doing the sanding. So I should also note that I've showed you quite a bit of sanding up to this point. I typically do the first pad of sanding to kind of get a feel for where my teeth marks are going to be, and then I do this file process, and then I'll go back to that first pad. The reason being is because you're going to want that heavier grit sandpaper to do as much of the work getting these little scratches and such that you're putting in it with a file. You're going to want as much of that to happen early in the process as possible, because I will tell you, with the high grit sandpaper, it's much more difficult to get the even tiny scratches out, because really you're just trying to polish once you get past the heavier grit. So you can see right there, I've got that tooth mark pretty well gone. So we're going to move on, but before I do, I want to show you one more tip. After I'm done sanding, at each time I want to kind of see how well it's doing, you'll notice I dry off the stem. And the reason I do that is because it's much easier to see the scratch marks that are left if you need to continue sanding with that particular grit. And it's much harder to see when it's wet. When it's wet, it'll look polished, it'll look like you're done, but as soon as you dry it off, you'll be able to see a lot of those scratch marks. So, little tip, dry it off after every stage, every time you want to inspect your progress. So here I'm just going to flash up kind of the from start to finish pictures after each sanding pad, just to give you an idea of how these stems brighten up through that entire process. Pretty amazing results. Okay, finally, we're off to kind of the second to last step, the last step before we do the polishing. And you'll see here I'm going to peel off the bottom four, or the lightest four sandpapers. And the reason I'm doing that is because I've decided on these pipes that I'm not going to strip them all the way down to briar. If I were, then I'd start with a heavy sandpaper to try to do most of the work and then move towards the lighter. But in this case, I'm going to try to save the finish, because when I'm doing restorations, if I'm actually trying to restore a pipe as opposed to modify it, my number one priority is to save the finish if I can. That will kind of keep the pipe as it was supposed to be when the pipe maker originally carved it. And I tend to like to do that for restorations, especially pipes that have any age on them. So I start with the fourth from the top and just start sanding the bowl. Now, I'll pay close attention to a couple of areas as I'm doing this process. One is edges, right? Anytime you're near a hard edge, that sandpaper is going to have a tendency to bite, and you could easily get down to the briar. The other area that I'm going to pay close attention to is any stampings that are on the bowl itself, usually on the stem, but sometimes you can find them other places. So I'll sand probably a little more gingerly in those areas, especially as I mentioned earlier, that Bertram, the stamping is already pretty light, so I'm going to be very careful as I sand that. Sometimes I go a little bit harder on the rims just to get all that gook off that we talked about earlier, and you just kind of go through the same process that you went with on the stems. You're going to start with the fourth, you're going to move to the third, second, and first, and by the time you're done, you'll be able to see that the bowl itself is going to look pretty good. Once you get it wet, you'll actually be able to see what it's going to look like when it's polished. So I'm going to fast forward through this section just so you can see how I go through this process for all the bowls, and then we'll move on to the next step. Actually, before we move on to the next step, as I mentioned before, I like to inspect the pipes at every stage if I can. It also kind of gives me a little bit of drive as you figure out that the things that you're doing are having a fairly significant impact. So I put the stems back on the pipes, and you can see this Sheridan, I'm sorry, well, it is a Sheridan made for a tinderbox, but it's a Chippendale. This thing has cleaned up quite nicely, and you can see the crack that I was talking about earlier. Definitely has had a fill, and there's also one in the stem, but neither seem to be substantial in terms of what they're going to do for the smoking of the pipe. So I'm going to continue forward to the Bulldog. So here's the Bulldog. It's cleaned up quite nicely as well. Luckily, I think I was able to save the Bertram logo, and I also found a stamp on the bottom marked 105. And then finally, here is the Even Reese. I think it's the 300 Jura. This thing turned out phenomenally. I'm a huge fan of the 327 Ellie, and this thing's really shaping up to be very similar to that pipe. All right, the final step in the process. Actually, the final two steps. So you'll see that I'm using a Dremel tool. That is white tripoli or white diamond compound. That's what you're going to use to polish the pipe. So after you've sanded, you're going to have a pretty good finish at that point, but you're going to see these things really brighten up when you go to polish. Now, a lot of folks use a polishing wheel on a grinder. I don't have one, and so I'll show you here that you can use a Dremel and get great results. Now, I will tell you, be careful around these edges. Anywhere that Dremel might have a tendency to catch, be very careful because it can easily pull the shank of that Dremel tool into the pipe and cause scratches, dents, stings, etc. So on the initial polish, I usually go a little firmer and quite a bit of polish. That's just me. And then you'll see as we go through the process that I go back and I do the pipe over again with a very light touch. So I want to get that really kind of a smooth finish with a little bit more pressure. And then the second time I go over very light because I'm really trying to get that shiny mirror-like finish. And they're going to brighten up quite a bit with this polish, and they're going to brighten up even more when we use the carnauba wax here shortly. So I'm going to speed this process up, get to the carnauba wax, and I'll show you that. All right, now we're on to the carnauba wax. So you can see it's a little bit different, but same process. Basically, we're just going to do the wash, rinse, and repeat. And we're going to do the same process for all of these pipes. And this is my favorite part because not only are you almost done, but you're going to see these things really shine up and become something that you're going to be proud of in the long run. So again, I'm going to speed it up. We'll get to the end. I'll show you the final product in just a sec. All right, and now a look at the final results. So first up is the Ewan Reese. And you can see how drastically this thing has changed. Again, as I said before, I love the grain in this thing. It turned out really nice. I think I'm really going to enjoy this pipe if it's not the one that's given away. Next up is the Chippendale, and you'll notice how dark this thing started off and how oxidized that stem was. And the process really lightened it up, highlighted the grain, and made that stem look virtually brand new. I love the bird's eye on this pipe in particular. It's got a really nice grain. Last but certainly not least is the Bulldog, and this one cleaned up nicely as well. And you'll see that it looks great. Now, I don't have a Bulldog, so I'm hoping this isn't the one, but never know. All right, so what's next? Well, I'm going to give away one of these pipes to one lucky winner. So I'm not going to do that in this video because I want the focus to be on the restoration process. And frankly, this video doesn't need to be any longer than it already is. So keep your eyes open in the very near future for the Restoration GAW giveaway video, which should be coming out shortly. Oh yeah, and FYI, I committed to not closing that drawing until I make the drawing video. So if it's not well into the future, more than one video after this video, and you've endured all the way through to the end of this thing, you still got a chance. So get out there, find the GAW video, and sign up by voting which one you want to see. In the meantime, I'm Roglide Soli. Keep the rubber side down.